Hello YouTube. This video we're going to do a little bit of a historical analysis here. I'm going to be making a case for Booker T. Washington. Yes, I know. Booker T. Washington by many throughout the 20th century has been considered what they call an Uncle Tom or a coon or any of these things, any of these derogatory terms, a sellout of the African American community. Now, the reason why I'm going to do this video is because I think sometimes you need to dig a little deeper to understand the reason why someone did something and some of the background information of this individual. All right, so Booker T. Washington was actually born into slavery in the year 1856 in Virginia. He eventually was liberated from enslavement, not when he was about at the age of 9, because of the fact that he was born in 56. Civil War came and went by 1865. And so he eventually became one of those kids that was always like trying to find a job and working odd jobs here and there, and eventually was able to raise money doing that. He eventually was able to go to college, Hampton Institute in Virginia, and then from there he received an education, a vocational education, and he also received the funds in order to start his own school eventually by the year 1881, and this is Tuskegee Institute. Now, at Tuskegee Institute, he was not only teaching people vocational skills in that school, but he was also teaching people how to start their own schools and how to start their own businesses as well. So that was also important to realize about Booker T. Washington. Now, this is where the fun stuff comes up. In the year 1895, right around the time where Frederick Douglass had passed away from old age, Booker T. Washington had become like the new head African American in charge, right? And so Booker T. Washington, he gave this speech in Atlanta called the Atlanta Compromise, where he was considered an accommodationist when he gave this speech. Now, he gave this speech in front of a wide audience of Southerners, many of whom were white, racist Southerners. Now, in Booker T. Washington's speech, he said that because this was at a time when African Americans were becoming more and more increasingly disenfranchised throughout the South, not having their ability or their rights to vote. They were being barred from voting because of grandfather clauses, because of literacy tests, because of poll taxes. And then he gave a speech, and instead of combating and fighting against the disenfranchisement of African Americans, he actually said, you know what? We don't even need the right to vote in this speech. He said, all we need is a basic education and equal protection under the law, and to be left alone. He said we don't need higher education, some of the things that W.E.B. Du Bois was fighting for. We don't need integration, some of the things that W.E.B. Du Bois was fighting for. And we don't even need voting rights, some of the things that Du Bois was also fighting for. He said all we need is those basic things: basic education and equal protection under the law. Boy, you can imagine how upset some of the African Americans were with him saying this. Now, they looked at him as a sellout. They looked at him as an Uncle Tom. They looked at him as all these things. But Booker T. Washington knew something that a lot of people didn't understand at the time, was that some of these white folks just like to hear, that they are superior. That's all they like to hear. And they like to hear what they want to hear. So when Booker T. Washington was saying those things, and then people like Du Bois and others were saying other things, they looked at Du Bois and others as rabble-rousers, but they looked at Booker T. Washington as that good Negro. Now, while Booker T. Washington was saying these things in his speeches, those same racist whites started to actually fund his operations. And Booker T. Washington was getting money to build his schools, build his communities, and Booker T. Washington's message was this: we don't want the white man, we don't want the state, we don't want the government, we don't need any of that stuff to, give us handouts. But if you are going to give us handouts, we're going to take this money and we're going to flip it. We're going to buy our own land, we're going to buy our own communities, we're going to build our own infrastructure. And Booker T. Washington emphasized the idea of African Americans using their hands and building. What good is it to learn poetry or learn about Shakespeare and higher education if you can't even grow your own food off your own land? What good is it to learn about the some type of intricate liberal art if you can't even provide for your own shelter, build your own shelter? So he says African Americans need to invest in their own education, in the mechanics, in agriculture, and the vocational skills, so they can build their own communities independent of the white man, independent of the government. And then by this, eventually African Americans will be able to show and improve themselves in a society as being the ones worthy of the merit of all the hard work and determination that they have. It's kind of similar to what happened in the like the 1940s in the major leagues. Major League Baseball teams were not giving black people opportunities to play baseball on those teams. But when the blacks had showed and proven themselves to be the best baseball players, they had to start picking those baseball players. There was a whole market, a whole field full of people that they weren't choosing. So once they chose Jackie Robinson, guess what? The next team had to choose a black guy who was just as fast, just as strong, just as smart of a baseball player. And eventually, as you can see, as time goes on, in the major leagues, in the NBA, in all these sports, the market has to start choosing the African Americans because they're the best ones for those jobs. The way Booker T. Washington saw it, he saw the same exact scenario before it actually happened in sports. But he said, if African Americans can prove themselves to be the best person, the most skilled, the most highly skilled for the job, they're the ones that are going to get the jobs. And with the money that they make from these jobs, they can build their own communities. Okay, so that's one of the things I wanted to talk about Booker T. Washington. And another side note that I want to mention was that while Booker T. Washington didn't outright say he supported W.E.B. Du Bois, and while he outright didn't say he supported integration or even fighting for political rights or voting rights, guess what he did behind closed doors? He secretly funded those operations behind closed doors. And he found ways to also manipulate the media with all the money that he was getting, secretly. See, Booker T. Washington was one that knew who his enemy was. Never let your enemy know where you stand. How do you fight warfare? You see, during the American Revolution, the British used to wear these bright red coats, and they used to go right up on their enemy and say, "We are the British," and they used to play the drums and make all this noise. And guess who they were facing? They were facing guerrilla warriors, guerrilla warfare tactics. See, in guerrilla warfare, you don't let your enemy know where you stand. You hide in the bushes, you're wearing camouflage, and you do whatever you have to do to make sure you pick off your enemy one by one. That's the tactic of a Booker T. Washington. So we've all seem to have been duped by him because we all looked at him as a sellout. We all looked at him as an Uncle Tom, blacks and whites. But those who actually knew what he was doing, knew his true endeavors, he wasn't letting his enemy know where he stood. And Booker T. Washington was able to actually have a certain degree of success by using these tactics. All right, so I'm gonna leave you with that. Remember, guys, the revolution will not be pesticides.